So let me talk really quickly about what are those pain points we were seeing. So first, Rene, you mentioned it, right? It is difficult to finance a carbon project. And it's particularly difficult to finance a carbon project for smallholders. Why? Because in a smallholder project, you do not own the land or any of the assets that are being used to generate the carbon benefit, right? And you don't want to. The whole purpose is to empower existing smallholder landowners to better manage their land in a way that leads to better livelihoods and better community benefits and so on and so forth, right? We're not trying to do a massive land grab and buy up all the land and install carbon projects on it. Now, that creates a problem, though, because when I go to the bank and I ask for a loan, and even if I can show them a primary source of repayment based on offtake agreements, hey, look, we're going to create these carbon credits, we're going to sell them at that, they're going to go, oh, that's great. Wonderful, wonderful theory. We love it. We love it. Out of curiosity, what's your collateral, right? What's your secondary source of repayment? And your answer is, our balance sheet. But for most carbon project developers, your balance sheet is tiny, right? Like so that's nothing. And so at this point, commercial debt goes out the window. So now you're having to talk to investors who are to varying degrees speculative in nature, right? And it demand much higher rates of return.
Welcome back to This Week in Carbon. I'm your host, Eddie Smith, and it's a pleasure to moderate today's discussion. Today we have with us Nathan Truitt, carbon market veteran and executive at American Forest Foundation. And as usual, we have our weekly bestie, Rene Velasquez. So I want to thank Nathan for joining us today. We've got some great topics to unpack, and let's dive right into it. So obviously, a topic that's on everyone's mind is the Science-Based Target Initiative and corporate climate action with regards to their new updated corporate net zero draft, right? And the global business community is increasingly aligning with science-based climate action. Today, over 7,400 organizations have validated science-based targets, and more than 10,000 have either set or committed to setting them under SBTI. And in response to mounting demand for clarity, SBTI released a draft of its updated corporate net zero standard. And for the first time, SBTI has been proposing ways to formally recognize carbon credits for ongoing emissions, carbon removal credits as tools to address residual emissions, and enhance guidance on location and time matching for Scope 2 environmental attribute certificates, EACs, along with a potential time-limited use of EACs for Scope 3, where direct mitigation isn't yet feasible, right? So this shift signals a maturing dialogue in the climate space. So it's no longer a binary debate of offsets versus real reductions. I mean, sometimes it is, but it's rather a nuanced exploration of how, when, and under what conditions carbon credits and EACs can play a constructive role in corporate's journey to net zero, right? So the question is, will these changes help corporates move faster and more transparently toward net zero goals in a time when climate action and investments is needed the most? Or will it make corporates, have an increasingly challenging time trying to achieve their sustainability targets, right? And given the complexity. So I'd be keen to hear your guys' thoughts on this. So what do you think?
Well, first, Eddie and Rene, just want to say it's great to be here. I listen to the podcast frequently, and Rene, I've watched a lot of stuff that you've produced over the years. So it's a real honor to be here and sharing my thoughts with you all. I really like, Eddie, how you put it, which is that this new SBTI draft represents maybe the opening stages of more of a dialogue between the various options and sides of this debate. Whereas if you go back and you look at the previous drafts, it felt much more like a dictate that SBTI was sort of announcing, and everyone else just sort of had to figure out how to make it work. And the basic problem is when you have that kind of approach, you basically have companies that are able to meet the terms of that dictate and companies that aren't. And that just bifurcates the corporate community into companies that say, well, okay, there's no way for us to participate in science-based targets, so therefore I guess we won't, right? We'll give up on climate action. And then companies that feel like they can meet the targets. And so the way SBTI, I think, has attempted to solve this in this new draft is by retaining its strongly held belief that internal decarbonization has to be prioritized, but giving companies a couple new tools and approaches to be able to approach internal decarbonization in a way that might allow them to participate and sort of meet their targets. And along the way, I think they've clearly made an effort to figure out the different places, and there are a couple different places in the guidance, where the voluntary carbon market and carbon credits can play a role. So I evaluate this new draft both on its own terms, where it is absolutely an improvement, although it didn't go as far as I would have liked it to go. But I also, just in terms of the tone of the draft guidance and the other actions that SBTI is taking, that's actually the thing that I am most excited about. To me, it just signals a willingness to listen and collaborate and co-design that in the past I feel like was mostly absent from the institution. And that's a big step forward in my mind.
Thanks, Nathan. I like that, and we've got a special guest here tonight. It's past her bedtime, my daughter Valentina. I really like the way you guys framed it. I think essentially we're on a journey, right? And it's evolving, and we're moving forward at least in the right direction, I should say. And I commend SBTI really for this approach that they've taken. Obviously, as a market practitioner and a big advocate for markets, I would have liked to have seen greater recognition of market instruments, environmental attribute certificates, playing a role to help those companies. And I love the way you said it, Nathan. It's providing them a tool, right, or tools in the arsenal for them to achieve their desired outcomes and to be part of this journey. And I think that they've opened the door to that. I think that as part of this consultation, or my hope is that the industry at large and corporates will voice their opinions around the way they want to go. I think that there's been, for a very long time throughout this process, and even looking before, SBTI kind of was formed, this very ideological and binary kind of approach to things. There is a decarbonization and mitigation hierarchy, and you eloquently elaborated on that, Nathan, right? Where we prioritize the internal reductions, we measure, we reduce, but then the offset piece is a choice, right? It's still voluntary. So there are certain corporates that have signed up to SBTI. I won't name certain names, but they've been very vociferous around the fact that they don't want to do it with offsets. But I think that I think that they are the minority, and I think that there are many other companies, especially those in really hard to abate sectors, that lack a real carbon price. They may have a shadow carbon price, and without a real implicit carbon price within their operations, they just cannot prioritize the really big ticket and capex intensive exercises to decarbonize. So if you're an industrial and you need to replace certain boilers or some sort of industrial machinery, it's really difficult to take that on as a in that first year or even amortize it over a number of years without an implicit carbon price. But the moment that you actually do and are allowed to have that, it will be justified. And so I think that we're leaving two really important tools off the outside of the toolbox effectively by not having that broader recognition and enabling the choice of the direction, because every industry and every company will find it difficult, certainly, and they'll have to choose their own approach. It's no different to how countries are doing it under Paris with the common but differentiated goals. So anyway, in summary, I think it's a great positive direction. I'd love to see an evolution and certainly a reflection on feedback from a wide range of different market stakeholders. Thoughts?
Yeah, that's well said. And I wanted to circle back to what you said before, Nathan, because I know you said it isn't where you want it to be, right? It's not. And I think a lot of people in the industry would agree with you, right? And that's what Rene kind of had just alluded to. So my question is, could you maybe unpack that? Like, where would you like to have seen it go? And in particular, I would love to hear about this. And because I think we'll see a future where it's going to be more and more clear that companies will not be able to decarbonize internally when they are set their goals by 2030, 2035. So in what particular areas would you have wanted it to hit on?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And to just take a step back, I think the way that we should all evaluate the Science-Based Targets Initiative or other target setting schemes, not just SBTI, is by asking the question, if every company participated in SBTI, every company set a science-based goal, and every company met that goal, would we have mitigated climate change, right? Because that's the task that they've set out, is to take the global science of net zero and downscale it, right, to the organizational level. And the way the current standard is written, the answer to that question is unfortunately no, right? In other words, every company on Earth could do that, but it would leave a few gaps. First of all, you would still have to deal with the ongoing emissions that are produced on the journey to net zero, right? Secondly, you would not have adequately funded the protection and restoration of nature, which every 1.5 or 2 degree scenario produced by the IPCC includes, right? And third, you would not have removed significant enough amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, right, to prevent a severe overshoot. Now, SBTI, this new draft does certain things to encourage, right, those other areas, but it doesn't yet require it, and I think it's an open question as to whether the incentives are strong enough. So that's how I approach it. Is great, SBTI very strong on emissions reductions. That's wonderful. It's good that you're encouraging that. The science does require that. Let's be clear, but the science also requires other things. And to what extent are you taking those into account? So now let's get specific. An improvement in this draft is that they took what used to be called the Beyond Value Chain Mitigation Guidance, right? Which is sort of a terrible acronym. It was this incredibly weedy, dense technical document that existed outside of the standard, right? So if you're a company, you had to go read another thing, and it was very, very complicated to understand. They've brought it into the standard and they've simplified it. They've just talked about it as companies being responsible for ongoing emissions, right? So that's good. What would have been better is some kind of requirement for companies to engage in taking responsibility for their ongoing emissions. I have sympathy for SBTI that they probably felt that companies would balk at that requirement, right? But let's flip that around, right? That's the reason why that requirement is important, is because without that requirement, companies are for 10, 20, 25 years continuing to dump carbon dioxide into the atmosphere really for free, right? So Rene, to your point, there's not an effective carbon price on those ongoing emissions. So I would like to see some middle ground between those two steps, right? On the one hand, we have it's voluntary and we want to recognize you. That's good. I don't want to, that's a step in the right direction. I understand that fully requiring it is probably a bridge too far. So what's the middle point, right? Could the middle point be, for example, that companies are required to set some sort of internal carbon price, and the fees generated by that carbon price must be devoted to beyond value chain mitigation through carbon markets or other instruments? That's an idea. SBTI has this requirement now within Scope 3 to have targets only for those activities that are more than 1% of your total Scope 3 emissions, or those categories that are more than 5%, which for most companies is going to add up to around 90% of their total Scope 3 emissions. Well, there's still 10% that's uncovered. So another idea, you could require that 10% to be compensated for through market-based instruments, right? So I think there's a variety of ways that SBTI could tweak this current draft to require companies to do more in that area. And then the final example of that would be in the removals side of the ledger. So just for everyone who's not familiar with SBTI, a net zero goal involves reducing your emissions, and then there's an acknowledgement that there's a certain amount of emissions, which are called residual emissions by SBTI, that won't ever be reduced. So what's an example of this? If you're a food and ag company, at a certain point, ceasing to use fertilizer will decrease yields and require you to clear more forest land to produce the same amount of good, right? So there's a certain point where there's just diminishing returns to decarbonization. And at that point, SBTI says, okay, once you've reached those residual emissions, you have to neutralize them through durable carbon dioxide removals, right? Before, they said you only had to do that at your target year. Now they've instituted the requirement to do things in the interim, which is good. But there too, they could be more aggressive. That requirement is only for Scope 1 currently. It could be extended to also include Scope 3. And there could be more sort of aggressive interim targets required. So these are all things that I think can be brought up now in this dialogue we've referred to. It feels like more of an open conversation. So those are just a couple examples, Eddie, of where I think SBTI could move even further in what I view as the right direction.
Yeah, very well said. So they it seems like they've cracked the door open, but they haven't, opened it up all the way. Rene, what are your thoughts on what Nathan has just said? Oh, wait, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I like that analogy, Eddie, and I'm resisting kind of pushing through the open door, right? Sorry, a dad joke. But I really like the way you framed it, Nathan. I understand obviously that the SBTI are in a situation where they need to balance essentially the expectations of their members that are making and setting targets using their framework, and the overarching ambition of what you stated, which is if every company in the world utilized this type of trajectory and target setting, could we actually achieve net zero? And if the answer is no, then I think greater ambition is the only lever that they need to keep pulling, even though it may ruffle a few feathers. There's clearly a decouple between the on paper kind of theoretical approach, right, and then the real world difficulties of decarbonization. And I think these kind of approaches that you kind of discussed really do make a lot of sense. I want to double click on one thing that you said that I found really fascinating, because I've been thinking about this, but you articulated in a really eloquent manner, which is essentially these residual emissions on the way to the target year. Let's say a company had a 2050 net zero target. And if they actually achieved the reductions from where they are today, or where they set their baseline, down to 2050, there's a really big tranche. It's a good triangle there of emissions, and that's in the best scenario. More often than not, we'll find that companies that will set these targets will not meet them. We're seeing that actively today with more ambitious targets, and that results with these residual emissions, as you said, And then we're effectively banking on technology that's yet to be scalable to effectively remove and scrub those emissions from the atmosphere. To me, we're banking on a future that is not guaranteed. And it puts a lot of pressure on the CDR industry. They're in their sort of early innings, and I think that's too much of a burden for them to carry. But separating that to the side, CO2 accumulates in the atmosphere, and it is long-lived. And so we're effectively baking in the temperature increases, right? Because some of that CO2 is sequestered, obviously, by nature-based systems, whether that be terrestrial or oceans, right? And I don't know what the percentages are, but some of that will persist for hundreds of years in the atmosphere. And so effectively delaying that action today through obviously a market-based approach, again, I keep coming back to this as a key proponent of this, it seems to me like a missed opportunity, effectively, because right now, and because it's a shared atmosphere, and the whole premise of carbon markets is that you can actually do the reductions, the avoidance, and the removals outside of first world, global north countries, and especially in global south countries, at a far, far lower price than you would in the global north. And then there are equitable contributions as a result of that finance going in and delivering impact beyond just the mitigation piece. And again, this very sort of rigid, I won't say puritanical because it's not, but it's a very rigid approach. It seems to miss that opportunity, right? I don't want to say forest in the trees, but like you said, there is a potential there for supporting and protecting nature-based systems, and this doesn't really open the door so much for that. And I'd love for you to unpack the nature-based piece.
Yeah, I think that was really well said, Rene. We do have a technology that is capable of being deployed at scale today that has been under research and development, constant research and development for hundreds of millions of years, right? That can remove carbon dioxide at, double-digit gigatons if effectively deployed. And that is photosynthesis, right? So we need to figure out what are all the ways that we can drive as much finance as possible to enhancing photosynthesis wherever it's occurring through better land management practices, right? That is such a powerful lever to mitigate climate change, and it is too often left on the sidelines. And the great power of carbon markets is to be able to activate that lever in the short term. Now, I totally get the perspective that you also can't count on that, right? At a certain point, nature will saturate, right? Even if you could fully activate it, that's not enough without emissions reductions, right? So the two things have to work together. And so I think this is why the idea of a dialogue is so important, because two things can be true at the same time. It can be true that without meaningful fossil fuel reductions, right, all the nature-based solutions in the world ultimately will not effectively mitigate climate change. That's true. But it's also true that without nature-based systems, all the fossil fuel reductions in the world will not fully mitigate climate change. These are two systems that have to work in concert with one another. And this requires just design thinking, right? A better design process. And for us to be able to do that, we need to get stakeholders in a room. We need to have the stakeholders that are focused on fossil reductions. We need to have the stakeholders that are focused on technological removals. We need to have the stakeholders that are focused on maintaining current stocks of biogenic carbon in tropical rainforests, for example, and in removing carbon dioxide through nature-based solutions. And we need to have a holistic process which says, how do we design a system for corporate action that gets us all of these things? Because we need all of them, right? And I think SBTI was so focused on the first one, and justifiably, right? Like the reduction of fossil fuel emissions is the most important thing. I would agree with that. So I can forgive them for starting there. It's really helpful to see them begin to incorporate these other things. And like you, I think they haven't gone far enough, and they need to be encouraged and supported to go farther.
Yeah, very well said. Rene, you have any thoughts? I saw your
No, I was just
eyes just
nerding
lit
out in the
up.
background. I was just thinking, I read this really awesome book called The Ends of the World, and I was just looking it up, Volcanic Apocalypse. And basically it talks about the great extinction events throughout geological timescales in history. And so I was just in ChatGPT, just kind of looking through so Nathan, you said it, right? You said essentially this technology has been in R&D for millennia, and I was just sort of querying ChatGPT here around what biological systems actually help to equilibrate the CO2 in the atmosphere. And you've got effectively obviously terrestrial plants in the Carboniferous period. You have diatoms, which are effectively silicon-based sort of cells that sequester, and then they're heavy, and so they fall down and create layers in the sediments, soil microbes, etc., and marine microbes like cyanobacteria. And the plant component is so important. And when we look at the deforestation that's occurred over certainly in modern times has been so significant, and this is just a great opportunity for us to reforest lots of parts of the world that are now facing significant climatic pressures, whether, because the topsoil then is not healthy, and then you get flood events, and then that gets washed away. And then that's got impacts with regards to the mangrove ecosystems and silting, et cetera. And there's this compounded effect of all the different systems. And there's these huge opportunities for us to not only protect the existing biomes, because they represent such significant biodiversity benefits, but also reforest those degraded lands. And in doing so, then we can avoid emission reductions and then remove emissions from the atmosphere at scale, whilst contributing to indigenous communities and disadvantaged communities globally, and help to improve the biodiversity. Like, hello, sign me up. It sounds like a great idea. But, and we're working through that, obviously, with DMRV and high integrity and mapping and all sorts of cool stuff. But the demand signal to support the underwriting for those opportunities to really scale, for debt financing to come in, and for banks to say, yeah, we'll underwrite this, no problems, is limited, because the demand of the buy side is sitting on the sideline saying, well, we're not recognized if we take this action under SBTI, right? It's not going to accrue on my carbon balance sheet as per my stated ambition. And my senior management only understands that we made a commitment and we're meeting the reduction pathway. Good enough. We'll kick the can down the line until we're all gray and old, and it's the next generation kind of inheriting this mess. And that I want that door that's cracked open to just open a little bit more and just provide that choice, just by providing the recognition. And then hopefully we start to see this kind of increase in the demand bit, and then the markets can start to deploy some of that capital and provide some of that direction that we need really to help this to scale. And as these markets evolve, then we start to see compression with regards to the costs, inputs, right? Distribution networks, all sorts of stuff, DMRV, blah, blah, blah. And I think that's a real positive opportunity.
Yeah.
So just a challenge to SBTI. I really commend what they're doing, but guys, if you can listen to folks that are level-headed and kind of see other opportunities here to help to increase ambition so that we all get to where that promised land is of net zero, but not defer it, that would be great.
Yeah, I so agree with what you said. And having spoken to a number of people who either work for SBTI or sort of engaged with advising them, I really do sense an openness, right? These are not a group of people who think that, carbon markets are a fraud or a scam, or who don't believe in sort of the promise that you laid out, Rene. They're just trying to figure out, like, how do you integrate that without accidentally removing the pressure on companies to address their own internal emissions, right?
I get it, but Nathan, like, it kind of is naive. I want to call out that naivety with regards to kind of failing to understand the market, because there's an assumption in that thesis that carbon credits are plentiful and never ending, right? That's not the case. Like, it is really, really difficult to stand projects up right now from a pure financing perspective. Then there's increased scrutiny by the programs that certify these outcomes to ensure that there's higher integrity and less overcrediting risks in particular for especially on the nature-based side. So you see a compression with regards to the actual supply that can be yielded. Like, let's talk about the yield bit, right? Like you mentioned with regards to agricultural inputs. So yields are decreasing. Financing costs are going up. Financing is incredibly difficult to justify. Debt financing is not available because of this lack of the demand piece. And then you have the time lag, right? It's not like you just turn on a switch and then bada boom, the emissions are removed. If you plant a forest today, it's going to take you at least 8 years for it to hit sort of some significant sort of removals to be delivered. So there's a lag on that response throttle. So to me, all of that shows is that actually there will be a really significant short squeeze in the next 3 to 4 years on the market when we do eventually start the race, start race kind of horn, and then companies start to emerge. There will be that delay with regards to response, and the cost of carbon goes up and up and up and up. That is actually really, really good, the cost of carbon going up, because it helps, as I said, to then create, as we go up that marginal abatement cost curve, opportunities where companies go, well, why am I going to pay an external supplier for carbon credits that are much higher when I can actually now justify these internal metrics? And now they actually push each other. They're not counterintuitive. They're actually two vectors going in the same direction. So markets are your friends, guys. Like, they can actually help you to empower this. And nature's your friend. So can we, get together?
That's very well said. And I do think that is something that they have not internalized, right? Like, for them, I think they think of, carbon markets and high integrity carbon credits as like a nice thing to do in addition to internal decarbonization. I don't think that they have really thought about the market and economics, right, of the system that they're setting up, and the way that a really well-functioning high-integrity carbon market can actually drive internal decarbonization. So that is something that we have to get them and their stakeholders to understand and accept. Right now, I think the progress that has been made, I think you're right, Rene. I mean, it's good to celebrate the progress and also to realize it's quite limited. I would say the progress is simply this. Companies that were participating in SBTI were under the impression that the use of carbon credits was somehow bad or not allowed by the standard. Now, to be fair to SBTI, that was a misreading of the standard, right? But, I still think they bear some responsibility for that, for not making it really clear that no. We support you going above and beyond. We support you addressing your ongoing emissions using carbon markets, so on and so forth. I think that they have corrected at least that impression. Now, what that then leaves for us to do, so we have two routes, right? Number one, and I think this is important because sometimes I feel those of us who work on carbon markets have sort of created this self-defeating prophecy where, all of our problems are kind of go back to SBTI, and the only way to solve them is through SBTI. So if we say that the door is now open, so we have two paths. Number one, we can convince SBTI to open it further, right? But number two, we can convince companies to go through the door with or without SBTI, right? And a lot of what I am working on now is trying to make the case to companies from a financial perspective of why participation in carbon markets will ultimately add value to your enterprise over the long term, right? All the ways that dynamic that you described, Rene, right, as using markets as a tool for internal decarbonization, among other things, will reduce your company's risk to long-term regulatory pressures, to disruption arising from fossil fuels, right? We could go through it. So that's something that we can all do today, with even if SBTA doesn't evolve a step further than what it is just really get good at making the case to companies of why they should do this, not only for climate reasons, but also for financial reasons.
Yeah, very well said. And speaking of your work, I think this is a good time to shift topics to the American Forest Foundation and the carbon credit auction that was held recently, featuring credits from the Family Forest Carbon Program, which is includes improved forest management initiative aimed at empowering small forest owners to monetize their stewardship. Right. So, I saw what you had posted on LinkedIn in regards to this, and some of the key insights were that there is strong demand for high integrity forest carbon credits. There was, I'm not sure about the specific numbers, but I think there was nearly 300 inquiries and 45 registered participants, right? And there was some interest in milestone-based prepayment models, but that's not yet scalable, as you would say. And though buyers are exploring it, are seen as market leaders per se. So would you be able to unpack this? Because, on the topic of forestry and corporate decarbonization and markets, now diving into, we rarely hear about a real-time experiment and how to sell carbon credits from the forestry sector to corporates, right? So I think it's good way to segue into this. Would love for you to kind of unpack this for us.
Yeah, no, very happy to. So just to say, the way we at the American Forest Foundation think about our carbon projects, which are contained under this banner of the Family Forest Carbon Program, is we think of them sort of as a laboratory and a demonstration, right? We can kind of test various hypotheses. And then based on what we learn, what we try to do is advocate for changes in how the market behaves, or how the market is regulated, or how individual actors in the market ecosystem behave. So the auction was a great example of that, right? Where we're looking at what's happening in the market and we're saying, okay, we have a theory on how we can address some pain points and create a market that's going to be able to scale quicker, right? So let me talk really quickly about what are those pain points we were seeing. So first, Rene, you mentioned it, right? It is difficult to finance a carbon project. And it's particularly difficult to finance a carbon project for smallholders. Why? Because in a smallholder project, you do not own the land or any of the assets that are being used to generate the carbon benefit, right? And you don't want to. The whole purpose is to empower existing smallholder landowners to better manage their land in a way that leads to better livelihoods and better community benefits and so on and so forth, right? We're not trying to do a massive land grab and buy up all the land and install carbon projects on it. Now, that creates a problem, though, because when I go to the bank and I ask for a loan, and even if I can show them a primary source of repayment based on offtake agreements, hey, look, we're going to create these carbon credits, we're going to sell them at that, they're going to go, oh, that's great. Wonderful theory. We love it. Out of curiosity, what's your collateral, right? What's your secondary source of repayment? And your answer is, our balance sheet. But for most carbon project developers, your balance sheet is tiny, right? Like so that's nothing. And so at this point, commercial debt goes out the window. So now you're having to talk to investors who are to varying degrees speculative in nature, right? And it demand much higher rates of return. Okay, well,
so can you give us examples of some of those, Nathan?
Yeah,
because I think that'd be really interesting for the audience.
Yeah, so for example, a typical thing is you'll have a fund, right, that has been established and is being run by an asset manager, and the asset manager wants to deploy capital into projects, and then they expect about a 20%, sometimes 25% annualized rate of return, right? Now, this works great in like infrastructure projects, right, or even in renewable energy projects, right? This is the playbook, the recipe we're trying to implement. But what's the problem with nature-based project? Rene, you mentioned it before. If I plant the trees today, it's 7 or 8 years until I'm creating a carbon credit. Well, if the return expectation is 20% annualized, that means that amount of money that they put into the project has to grow by 20% per year for 8 years. Everyone at home can do the math with a spreadsheet. It means that project has to return a massive amount of money. And as much as I love photosynthesis, it's just not able to produce that level of return, right? For most carbon projects, the trees just don't grow that fast, right? Okay, so we can't get debt because we have no collateral. We can't get equity, those kind of investments, because the return expectations are too high. How are we going to solve this? There's a number of ways that this will get solved by the market eventually. For example, carbon insurance products could allow you to go to the banker and say, okay, here's your secondary source of repayment, right? Like if the credits aren't produced and delivered, this insurance company will step in and will be able to return. Loan and bond guarantees by multilateral development institutions or by host country governments or by philanthropic actors, that could be another way to give access to debt. On the investment side, funds are being created that have much lower return expectations, right? Based on a number of things. So if we give this 2 or 3 or 4 years, like it's going to be solved. But here's the problem. We don't have 2 or 3 or 4 years to wait. We got to get these projects up and running now. So what's a way to do that? In our opinion, the best way to do that is for buyers to put finance into these projects, right? Now, they don't want to do that. One of the reasons they don't want to do that is because what happens if they put money into the project and the project fails? They've lost their money. They didn't get any credits. This is an unacceptable risk for them. So our counter solution to that is what we call a milestone-based prepayment contract, where the project developer is using their own capital, their own resources to sort of aggregate the land, right? Plant the trees, install the MRV, get the project ready so it's significantly de-risked. And once that's done, then a buyer puts money into the project, right? And the next year the project grows, it gets more acres, more trees planted, the buyer puts more money into the project. The buyer never fully prepays, right? There's always some portion of the payment that waits until delivery. So getting to the auction, Eddie, we had designed this based on a lot of feedback from buyers, this sort of approach to how a buyer could make a prepayment, but sort of have their risks and concerns addressed. And then we thought, how are we going to test if this is acceptable to the marketplace, right? A really good way to get a lot of feedback really quickly would be through an auction, where instead of having bilateral conversations, right, which takes 6 to 12 months, one buyer at a time, we're going to create a data room. We're going to put all this out there. We're going to have webinars to educate people. We'll just see what buyers think through an auction process. So really, we were testing 2 hypotheses, right, bundled together. Hypothesis 1, are companies willing to engage in these sort of milestone-based prepayments? Hypothesis 2, could you use an auction format to sort of rationalize and streamline the process of getting these in place? I would say we have partially validated the first hypothesis, right? We've signed our own milestone-based prepayment contracts before the auction. From the auction, we got interest in buyers wanting to sign more of them. However, I think it's pretty clear that this is going to be limited, unfortunately. There's still the majority of buyers, they just want to sign an offtake agreement and have you figure out the financing on your own, which is unfortunate. And I do think they're being kind of short-sighted, but whatever. The data is what the data is. I think we thoroughly invalidated that an auction format was the way to do this. At the end of the day, we didn't receive any bids on the auction, right? And throughout the auction, which lasted a week, almost all of those 45 companies that were involved let us know, you know what, we can't figure out how to make this work in an auction. So once the auction is over, give us a call and we'll do the same old bilateral thing. So my big takeaway, just for people who are listening, like what to learn from this. Number one, although prepayments make a lot of sense from our perspective as a developer community and really from a climate science perspective, because they respond to the urgency of the moment, they're just not going to be adopted at any scale. So if you're a developer and you can get them, do it, right? But don't build your financial model around the idea of prepayments, would be my suggestion. Secondly, I don't want people to get the impression that auctions don't work. We didn't test an auction for all use cases, right? I still think an auction for spot credits could be quite successful, but an auction for these sort of forward-looking, fairly complex contractual instruments, not going to work. And the reason is the buyers that are active in considering, that are sophisticated enough to consider that kind of arrangement, they have invested a lot in their own internal due diligence teams. They have their own methods of procuring credits. And so what they said to us in one form or another is like, hey, look, we've figured out how to do this well under current market conditions in a way that advantages us. Why would we give up that advantage to participate in an auction where we lose all of that power and leverage, right? Which is fair. So I would also say that learning itself is provisional. To your point, Rene, 4 years down the line, when like the demand for high integrity nature-based credits far outstrips the supply, I think it'd be interesting for someone to try this again. You might get a different result. Anyway, that was a very long, rambly answer, Eddie, but I wanted to kind of give a download of everything we were trying to learn and everything we think we did learn, and happy to answer any other questions about that.
Yeah, no, that was excellent. That was excellent. Thank you for your insights. Rene, you want to jump in?
I loved that. No, I loved it. And I love how you defined this very scientific process. And I do agree that, and I keep coming back to this in terms of realization, as we work now more and more with sell-side participants, helping them to bring projects to the market, that project developers are an incredible and passionate but wild bunch. And they, like you said, they lack the balance sheet strength. Hopefully that changes over time. But certainly they lack the sophistication, one, in terms of speaking to financial intermediaries. That's one thing that we figured out. And the other bit that you mentioned is that, yeah, the buy side is fairly risk-off when it comes to the pre-financing, because it's akin to venture capital play. And unless you're speaking to the corporate venture arm of that large, multinational, even they don't have the remit to do something like this, but it's akin to that, right? We'll make a bet and it could pay off, it may not pay off. And if you're trying to balance the books effectively on the carbon book side, you might not be so willing to do that unless it was a nascent technology and you wanted to see kind of evolution of that and you wanted to kind of incubate some of that R&D. When it comes to the nature-based side, yeah, they have every right to then turn around and say, well, let's help you de-risk your financing stack by providing you with a good solid offtake. Look at our credit rating, take this to the bank. Most banks that we speak with, to just kind of bring in that third party, have told us that in principle that they're very happy to engage in terms of debt financing, subject to the quality of the offtake agreement and the off-taker in this case, right? But what I'll say around the auction format, and I like the really, again, academic but also very honest assessment with regards to the lessons that you learned from this, and saying that the auction format didn't meet the kind of needs of the buy side group on the forward curve, but it could potentially on the spot. I think that's been proven. There's multiple auction platforms. Folks at Expansive, CIX have got auctions that they've done, for example, that have been successful. And I do think, Bursa Malaysia did an auction last year, and they had some success as well. And I think that for spot credits, that the auction platform does meet the criteria. But like you said, there's a kind of a bias here that the corporates here are, you're effectively, in terms of the sort of eligibility kind of bias or the selection bias, you selected really sophisticated corporates, I would assume. Very large multinationals with the skill set, with the expertise, with the team depth of the bench, with regards to conduct their own due diligence processes. To them, they're asking internally and maybe subvertly here, why would I give up my asymmetry, right? If I'm part of the Symbiosis Coalition and I can put out my RFP and I can get thousands of projects coming to us and we can then glean insights from that data, Why do I need to be part of an auction where the stated purpose is to actually create an inflationary pressure with regards to my buy side price? Let me pick them off one by one, right? But what I think would be really interesting again is if we had a wider, like a larger cohort. So think of it like a clinical trial. In this case, we're in a phase 1 or phase 2, right, with a very small group. If you did a phase 3 with a much larger population, in this case, carbon companies looking to purchase carbon credits because there was recognition, coming back to the previous story around SBTI. So we had the like Fortune 500 and beyond, right? If those companies all came to it, then inherently competition would emerge, and you would see that inflationary pressure because they would realize, oh my goodness, the supply is fairly constrained. But right now, where it's a buyer's market, they have all the luxury and time in the world. I'd be really keen to run this experiment again in 5 to 10 years' time and see what's the result there.
Yeah, right? I think you're absolutely right. I think to some extent, although let me just admit this is very self-serving thought, but to some extent, I think we were a little bit ahead of our time with this. Mm-hmm. So I think in a few years you'd see something different. I mean, the core problem is
I know that feeling, Nathan. Yeah. We came out with an exchange, a carbon exchange early on, and certainly the founders of Expansive tried it in 2009. That was early. When I joined, it was 2015, and that was still 5 years too early. So I know that feeling where people are like, what do we need this thing for?
Yeah. And yeah, to your point, now those models are up and running, right? So I think you might see something like that. But I really want to double click on your point there, Rene. I mean, to some extent, the core problem that we just can't get around, no matter how sort of sophisticated we want to get with these things, is that for 99% of companies, the purchase and retirement of a carbon credit is it feels totally optional to them. Like, we'll do it in a good year, we won't do it in a bad year. And this gets back to the issue with SBTI, or how we make the case to companies that no, guys, this is a critical tool in the toolbox. It's a source of long-term competitive advantage in a world where carbon management is clearly going to be expected of every company by its investors, employees, customers, and other external stakeholders, right? Once we get that in place, and then it becomes a competition for scant resources, something like this, I think, would work. Yeah. So I don't want anyone who's out there thinking of their own auction facility to think that we feel like we've invalidated auctions. We clearly didn't. We invalidated them under a very limited set of circumstances, and hopefully those circumstances will change as the market evolves.
Yeah, I think it's funny. So you correctly highlighted it, right? So we talked last week to Rene and Steve Zwick from Carbon Paradox, and they highlighted it in and I was just looking it up. So paradox number 12, the voluntary paradox, right? Yeah. Where this is one of the bugs in our approach, that it is very much a voluntary initiative for corporates to embrace. And in good times, it's great. And then we've actually seen the market harness that momentum, and we saw an increase in liquidity, and we saw the commensurate increase in price. And then that begat this kind of flywheel effect where financials then started to say, hey, this is an interesting asset class. We want to play with this thing because we see the long-term, the tailwinds, and we see the long-term kind of direction of travel. Ooh. And then we started to see all the infrastructure emerge, futures contracts and auction platforms, all this sort of other great stuff and innovation being harnessed. But that's the Achilles heel. As long as it remains voluntary, it can go away when the wind shifts. And we've seen it, very large corporates that have made big commitments, allocated huge budgets to achieving their voluntary commitments. In tough times, or when they face some pressures with regards to criticisms, will just walk it back. And there's really no pressure for them to remain. There's no sort of check on their share price, for example, right? The reputational direction only blows in one way, one direction, right? The reputational risk, I should say, which is, if you do this voluntarily and it backfires, then you just walk it back, right? And then there's no reprimand. Whereas in the compliance markets, that's that stick and carrot approach. We'll give you the carrot incentive, but in this case, there's just no stick, and that has to change. And I think that we're all understanding this paradigm that we live in, right? It's that we need this decarbonization to occur and to occur now and to occur at scale. And if we don't, then we really bake in the worst effects of climate change, and we break through the 1.5-2 degree targets pretty quickly. I think we're already past 1.5, frankly. And 2 degrees is just on the horizon, and that makes life very, very difficult. And you talk about agricultural outputs, you talk about resilience in just low-lying countries, et cetera, and then the migration effects and all these different compounded effects. And we start to see these tipping points really unlock, and it's not a good outcome. And it's just because we're not listening to the science. But there needs to be that shift. And kind of back to where we began, I think SBTI have done such a great job, and they've gotten to this point where corporates really have selected them. It's been a natural selection process for them to emerge as the high watermark in terms of standard. And that's why I think we in the carbon markets really hope that they see a potential for encouraging just certainly the recognition piece, and then hopefully that creates peer pressure amongst other companies and certainly stakeholders, shareholders, I'm thinking in particular, but civil society as well, to hold companies accountable. And that if you then withdraw from a science-based target, that there ought to be some sort of repercussion of not just of walking that back. Because now companies have all worked together, the industries work together to put them up on this mountaintop effectively. And now any company that doesn't have that metric does see a material decrease either in their in their ratings, or increase in financing costs, or reputational risks. Those things actually will be sticky, and if we can work in tandem, hey, I think great things could happen.
Yeah, I maybe like a sort of closing thought, because this is a whole different podcast, but I think to add to sort of the sense of urgency that you just conveyed, Rene, about the very real consequences that we're beginning to sort of lock in for our kids and our grandkids and future generations, right? To get even a little bit more depressing for a second, we have to solve all those problems that you just identified, and we have to solve it without the meaningful involvement of the public sector. And I think everyone needs to get their heads wrapped around that, right? Like the past year, we have seen the political class in countries around the world sort of indicate we can support climate action, but only up to this level, right? And that to me was the big message from COP29. $1.3 trillion is what's needed for the transition. Well, we governments, we'll commit to 300 billion. And actually, if you look under the hood, it's not really even anywhere close to that, right? So that means there's at least $1 trillion gap that we all are going to have to figure out based on private action. Just to repeat that, $1 trillion annual gap that we're going to have to figure out based on private action. So to me, the way to do that is to flip that question of why companies buy credits when times are good and they don't when times are bad on its head. And here I want to speak to the investors in companies, right? If you're invested in a company, if a company is part of your portfolio, and they're buying voluntary carbon credits to address their ongoing emissions, and then a year happens where they're like, ooh, it was a tough year. We can't really afford to do that, so we're not going to do that. I would like you as an investor to ask yourself the following question. What does that say about that company's ability to survive in a future where carbon prices have gone up, where carbon regulations are stricter, right? Where there are actually regulatory implications of not being able to address your carbon pollution? What it should tell you is that company is not fit for purpose in that future, right? That actually there's a very significant risk. A company that says we can't afford to offset all of our emissions, let me translate that to you. We cannot survive the transition to a low carbon economy. That's what that company has just said. And you as an investor really ought to take that into account in terms of the companies that you invest in, because this transition is either going to happen or capital markets, capitalism, civilization itself is going to be on the ropes by 2050. So this is where I'd like us as a community to get stronger, right? Is making the economic case to companies not based on what did SBTI say, or what do ENGOs say, or what's the right thing to do, or what's the responsibility to future generations, but just simply in terms of you as a corporate leader need to demonstrate your institution's ability to survive in the future.
Yeah.
And the VCM is a powerful way to do that.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I love the way, because I think a lot of people get caught up talking about the physical climate risks, and not so much as the transition risk from policy change, technology change, and just the cost of capital for projects or companies that are polluting more than others, right? Like the ones that are sustainable will be in the money in the long run, in the end. So yeah, great insights there. An awesome way to end off the episode. Thank you so much for joining, Nathan. Rene, do you have any final thoughts?
I'm not going to wade
No.
into that. That's an exclamation
Yeah,
point,
that
Nathan.
was-
Thank you. Amazing.
It's amazing. Thank you so much. So that's a wrap for this week in Carbon. And once again, a huge thank you to Nathan for joining. And if you enjoyed this discussion, be sure to follow us on LinkedIn and YouTube, and tune in next week. And actually, next week we'll be at the European Climate Summit in Lisbon, Portugal. So we'll be getting some in-person content from the folks there, and there'll be some great interviews. So be sure to tune in.